How to tell when you're ego-identified, from in the world but not of it. Greetings. This is the one you've known as Jesus the Christ. It isn't that difficult to tell when you're ego-identified. There are certain telltale signs. If you can recognize the ego in a thought before you identify with that thought, that's even better. However, many thoughts that appear quite neutral have the ego driving them and hiding in them, and those might still catch you up. Identifying with thoughts that have little ego in them is not much of a problem. Believing a thought that has a lot of ego in it is another story. Those types of thoughts, if not obvious to you, will be obvious to others and likely trigger their own egos. For example, if you were to say to your partner, "I ended up being right about that," your partner might just agree with you, even though your ego is getting the best of you in that moment, albeit subtly. Only the ego cares about being right and will use any opportunity to score a point. But if instead of that you said, "You really blew it," those words just might start a fight in which your partner points out all the times you blew it. Those words have much more ego in them. The tone of the voice in your head and of your own voice when speaking to others, and the language used, has a lot to do with whether a statement activates your ego or someone else's. Thoughts or words that are emotionally charged, such as "you really blew it," are bound to elicit negative feelings, much more so than a more objective comment. This applies to your internal self-talk as well. If you say to yourself, "I really blew it," that has a much greater chance of making you feel bad and for longer than saying, "I ended up being wrong about that." What you say to yourself and how you say it really matters. Many have learned over the years to talk to themselves more kindly and objectively, and that keeps the negative ego in check. You can train the voice in your head to be more positive, neutral, and friendly by not listening to or identifying with it when it's negative and unkind. If you work with it, the voice in your head can become more benevolent. But you don't need that benevolent voice either. You don't need the voice in your head at all. The most obvious sign that you're ego-identified is emotional reactivity and negative feelings such as fear, anger, hurt, jealousy, envy, or hatred. When such feelings arise, you've become your ego, even if only briefly. The more you engage in the thoughts that produce those feelings, the longer those feelings will last, and the more powerful a hold they'll have on you. The strength of your negative feelings is a measure of how strongly and possibly how long you've bought into a belief or story. Those feelings, in turn, convince you there's a reason to feel that way. Otherwise, why would you feel that intensely? The answer is, you feel that way because you believe your thoughts, not because your thoughts are true. Your feelings convince you that your thoughts are true, even when they aren't. People don't realize that their thoughts are what make them feel the way they do, not circumstances. The ego uses circumstances to create feelings by telling a story about those circumstances, and that story makes you feel bad. If, for example, you believe the thought, "I'm going to be homeless," you'll feel terrified. Those feelings of terror convince you that becoming homeless must be a real possibility. Without realizing, you feel alarmed because you believed that thought, not because that thought is true. The mind just makes things up, It doesn't have a crystal ball. The strength of a feeling is a measure only of how strongly and frequently you've believed a thought, not of a thought's veracity. Any thought that's entertained frequently will seem true because it will produce feelings that make it seem true. Furthermore, if a thought is entertained often enough, it will become habitual, and the resulting feelings will become habitual. For example, if you give angry thoughts your attention, you'll create a habit of thinking those thoughts. Then your anger will also become habitual and easily and automatically triggered. People do this with grief as well. As normal as it is to grieve over a loss, many magnify and extend their grief unnecessarily by focusing on sad thoughts and returning to them repeatedly. Then thinking such thoughts becomes habitual, and the feelings become habitual. Eliminating this pattern from the neural circuits will take a concerted effort to discontinue the habit, as it does with any habit. Negative feelings are the most obvious sign the ego is in play. But you can also assume you're ego-identified whenever you feel contracted. This manifests as a sense of contraction in your body and feeling tense, tight, stressed, restless, out of balance, irritable, annoyed, or dissatisfied. You might feel on edge, like you want to pick a fight. Or when the contraction is extreme, you might feel like giving up or curling up in a ball. More often than not, negative feelings and a sense of contraction go hand in hand. The opposite of contraction is feeling peace, ease, contentment, relaxation, gratitude, joy, and a sense of being in the flow or being lost in what you're doing. These are the hallmarks of the divine self. If you aren't feeling this way, you're involved with the ego to some extent. The degree to which you're ego-identified is the degree to which you lack peace and contentment and feel dissatisfied and ill at ease. You are always receiving feedback from your divine self about how aligned you are with it. It tells you through a sense of contraction or expansion and through positive and negative feelings whether or not you're an ego and just how much. The divine self is always communicating with the human self and doing what it can to bring the human self into alignment with it, while simultaneously honoring your free will to choose to be ego-identified. Being very present to your energetic, emotional, and bodily experience will tell you just how identified you are with the ego. Once you realize you're ego-identified, you can get curious about how you got caught. What thoughts were you thinking? What beliefs or self-identities were you believing? Do you want to keep feeling this way? When you have enough awareness to stop and ask these questions, then you have a choice. Go back into identification or become more present. The antidote to the suffering caused by ego-identification is to turn your attention away from the thought stream to your present moment experience, what you're seeing, hearing, feeling, and sensing physically, and more subtly. Doing this will bring you out of the mind and back into your body and senses. This is where you want to stay, because the body and senses are a door into presence, into Christ consciousness. From there, life is experienced very differently. Whenever you drop out of the mind into the body and senses and into presence, the reward is peace, contentment, gratitude, love, and joy. The trick is to stay in the body and senses long enough to drop into presence, and then to stay in presence long enough to get enough of a taste to want to stay there. The more familiar you become with presence, the more the voice in your head loses its attraction. Finally, another clue that your ego identified is the subtle pleasure you get from being right, feeling superior, being selfish or unkind, complaining, judging, blaming, or doing any of the other things the ego pushes you to do. On some level, it feels good to be bad. Saying what the ego wants you to say provides some pleasure, some satisfaction. At the very least, the pressure to say it is relieved once it's spoken. The ego's way is the path of least resistance. As such, it is often irresistible. However, the pleasure you get from indulging the ego is a double-edged sword, because feeling superior, being selfish or unkind, complaining, judging, blaming, and doing the other things the ego does to get this fleeting pleasure ultimately doesn't feel good and doesn't have good results. You feel bad about yourself when you do things that make others feel bad. This is the meaning of, "Whatsoever you have done to the least of my brethren, you have done to me." What you do to others, you also do to yourself. When you judge others, you are also hurting yourself, because you can't be judgmental and be happy. When you are unkind to others, you are also being unkind to yourself, because you can't be unkind and be happy. When you don't forgive someone, you are also harming yourself by holding hatred inside. Whenever you are in ego, you not only hurt others, but also yourself. That's how people learn to not be an ego. This lesson is built into life, and it is how life brings you back home to love. Being at peace, being content, and being loving and in harmony with others is what feels good. The ego takes you away from this peaceful state, from what you really want. Becoming sensitive to how you're getting pleasure from hurting others, and also hurting yourself when you're doing that, will help you make another choice. It would be easy to conclude that thoughts are a problem, but only when thoughts cause you to lose touch with your divine self are they a problem. Your relationship to thought is what changes with spiritual progress, not so much whether thoughts are running through your mind or not. As you disidentify with your thoughts, the thought stream becomes increasingly quiet and neutral or benign. You can and may still be involved with some of your thoughts and even speak them, but you won't believe them to the degree you once did. When you don't take your thoughts, especially the I thoughts, so seriously, as if they were personally true, they lose their fascination along with their bite. Then they can just be there, like the clouds or any other thing that belongs to this world of form. Thoughts are part of life as a human being, and once the truth about them is seen, they're no longer a problem. Thank you for being here. I am with you always.